Bleach is a manga that exists, and like every other manga, Bleach also has a plot. But sometimes plots have holes, you see. That's why they're called, stay with me now, plot holes. I know, mind blowing. Sometimes my genius is almost frightening. So I'd like to welcome you to the channel. I'm Sir Yvonne, definitely the name on the channel, and also a guy who doesn't make Bleach videos. And in this video, we'll be talking about the biggest plot hole in all of Bleach. But before we even start to dig into it, I think it'd be necessary to figure out just what a plot hole actually is. Because with the discourse surrounding them, it really feels like blockchain, where everyone's mentioning it, but nobody really knows what it is. And yes, that was a blockchain joke in Big 2025. Yeah, the bar is definitely in hell, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you survive the experience. Now, the Oxford Dictionary defines a plot hole as an inconsistency in the narrative or character development of a book, film, TV program, etc. This definition implies that plot holes aren't actually unexplained plot points, but rather inconsistencies in how a story traverses from one plot point to the next. You can simply define it as when a story says the answer is A and then proceeds to choose Q without ever explaining why Q is the now preferred choice. But fortunately, plot holes are mostly just minor inconsistencies that you can fix with a bunch of binding vows, a dash of Hashirama cells, and call it a day. Not so commonly, though, plot holes can be massive, world breaking contradictions in a story's established logic that can completely destroy it from within, even to the degree of retroactively erasing all the events of the story by making it impossible for any of its events to have happened in the first place. Unfortunately, though, the plot hole we're about to talk about is of the latter kind, one that is tied to none other than the star of the show himself, Ichigo Kurosaki, who honestly should have died long before the story even began. Now, one last thing before we begin, I'd like to preface this video by saying that I, Sir Yvonne, have neither read nor watched anything that happened in the story after Aizen's defeat. Don't bother checking the channel, you're not going to find anything that contradicts that statement. What's more interesting, though, is why I haven't watched it. You see, being a world-class media analyst, emphasis on the first four letters, with certification in media literacy from the home of civil discourse and free thought, Reddit, I have concluded that the perfect point to end the story is when the main character loses the one thing that has come to define who he is and his connection to that world without any further resolutions to his character. And before you start talking about built up plot points and details that clearly indicated there was more after Aizen, look. It's not my fault nobody told Kubo to just put the fries in the bag. I don't make the rules here. So with that finally out of the way, let's get right into it. So when we're first introduced to Ichigo at the start of the story, there's a couple of things we learn about him, like the fact that even before he received Shinigami powers from Rukia, Ichigo could already see and physically interact with souls, which would mean that he had spiritual powers all his life. This fact becomes very relevant in the face of the next thing we learn about Ichigo, which pertains to the death of his mother, Masaki Kurosaki. I think it goes without saying that Masaki's death is easily the most pivotal moment in Ichigo's life. It's quite literally the reason he becomes the character we know and love. But putting that aside, Masaki's death is also one of the most bizarre events in the entire story. Like, it's actually almost funny how silly it looks once you begin to pick apart the details surrounding how she died. And you need to look no further than the very first thing we're told about how she died, which was the fact that her death was a murder and that she was actually killed by a hollow. See, in isolation, this is a perfectly believable event. Hollows randomly killing people is just about as common as you conveniently staring at your home screen whenever someone walks into the room. Wink, wink. So clearly, that shouldn't be much of a problem. But it does, however, balloon into some really serious weirdness once you start to look beyond that basic detail. Because while hollows do love their human souls, they tend to like a little more spice in their diet. And by spice, I mean they much prefer to consume the souls of beings who possess high spiritual pressure and energy than your average human soul. Why does that matter, you may ask? Well, it's because Masaki wasn't alone that day. She had a very young, spiritually aware Ichigo with her at the time, who, need I remind you, had such strong spiritual abilities that he couldn't just see souls, he could even touch and speak to them. And with only those abilities, it would have all but guaranteed that he'd be the perfect meal for a hollow, with strong enough abilities to satisfy the hollow's hunger, but not strong enough to fight it off in case he had to defend himself. But for some bizarre reason, Ichigo, the perfect meal, is completely ignored in favor of his totally normal human mother, and no further explanation was ever given as to why that happened. But that's not even where all the weirdness stops. Oh, no, 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 no. It gets much, much worse. Because we haven't even talked about our killer yet. Introducing the Grand Mob himself, whose existence in this tale really serves as the final nail in the coffin and truly cements it as a plot hole for the ages. Because from the moment this guy enters the story, they make it painfully clear that he's built different. Like, r slash not like other hollows kind of different. And I'd even go ahead to call him a celebrity hollow, because according to Rukia, old Moppy over here has been a thorn in Soul Society's side for over 54 years, and was notorious for killing quite a number of Shinigami within those decades. But more importantly, could you guess the most interesting thing about this guy over here? Wait for it. Wait for it. He apparently only goes after victims with high spiritual pressure. You cannot make this up. So let's get this straight. Ichigo's totally normal human mother gets killed and has her soul devoured by a hollow who specifically goes for victims with high spiritual pressure. All while Ichigo, who fits Lil Moppy's preferences much better, is just left alive. And the story just shoves this into our faces and then never explains anything else. Okay, you know what? Let's do it. Let's whip out our copium tanks and start huffing. After all, what's Bleach without Kubo's fans writing 99% of the story for him? So let's try and figure out a possible reason for why Kubo just decided that the giant mob killing Masaki instead of Ichigo made any sense. What does the kids call it these days? Kubology? Okay, yeah, let's do that. So let's say maybe Grand Mopper was like scared someone was going to sense him and come wipe him out. Let's first ignore the fact that this guy hasn't a shred of the fear of God in his mop head, but assuming we entertain the possibility, in his defense, Karakura was a massive supernatural hotspot. Aside from the city itself being a Jureichi, it also housed some of the most powerful beings on the planet. Specifically, Kisuke, Ishin, Tessa, Yoruichi, the Visors, and whatever Shinigami Soul Society would have deployed to watch over the city. But unfortunately, none of these candidates would ever work as a reason for Grand Mopper to be in a hurry to leave Karakura, because all the Shinigami I mentioned were hiding from Soul Society, and while they had more than enough power to wipe the mob from existence, they lived in Gigai, which made their massive spiritual pressures basically untraceable and undetectable. Else Renji and Byakuya would have sensed them first thing the moment they set foot in Karakura in the first arc. So for Hollow like Grand Fisher, who had yet to gain the enhanced senses of Pesquisa, he would have definitely never sensed them. He wouldn't have even known they existed, and no, we're not even entertaining the possibility of Grand Fisher being scared of Shinigami NPC 1706. No. But don't worry though, the copium tank isn't empty just yet. We can keep huffing. Like, what if Rukia was an unreliable narrator? Let's pretend she didn't just back up her claim with 54 years of Soul Society's knowledge. Let's just say she was wrong about Grand Fisher, and that he was really just a regular hollow and his killing Masaki was just random hollow shenanigans. Unfortunately, that still wouldn't explain why Ichigo survived, since there was literally nothing stopping him from tossing Masaki's soulless corpse aside and grabbing the happy meal that was Ichigo. But even more importantly, this idea completely contradicts everything we see Grand Mopper do and say. His every action and statement confirms everything we've already heard about him. He explicitly states that Yuzu's soul wasn't worth consuming, despite her also having above average spiritual abilities. He even goes ahead to say that it's Karin, who had even stronger spiritual abilities, that was worth devouring between the two sisters. And had it not been for the fact that Yuzu had literally walked into his hand, he wouldn't have even bothered with her. But even among beings with high spiritual pressure, the Grand Mop was still picky about who to kill. And as if it couldn't get any worse, the story tries to convince you that Grand Fisher killed Masaki because he mistook her for Ichigo and that Ichigo was the main target all along. But then it just forgot to kill its main target for whatever reason and then proceeded to disappear from the story until it was convenient for it to show up again. No matter how you try to spin it, this is jarringly bad writing. So bad that it actually removes any reason for the entire story of Bleach to even exist, simply because the story could not give its readers a believable reason for why its protagonist should have lived past the age of 9. Like, y'all keep going on and on about how it fell off after Soul Society, but that is so 2016. This mid fell off before it even started. And after this amazing video that totally won't be flipped on its head by one single detail, I think it's safe to say that Bleach and its fanbase have been completely destroyed with facts and logic. Now if you'd excuse me, I'm gonna go watch some real peak fiction Boruto's Funamushi arc. Okay, so I have absolutely no idea who that guy was or how he got into my room, and I would very much prefer if you don't ask why I decided to brutally murder him the second I got in. But yeah, looking at what he was cooking over here, you really should have just read the manga, man. But yes, I'm gonna have to do the needful now. So I'll be taking over from here. I am Res Novi, which is definitely the name on the channel this time. And basically, what my scatterbrained friend all over the floor was trying to say was that from the very beginning, the circumstances surrounding Masaki's death were far too strange. Because for a character who was implied to be nothing more than a regular human, every single event surrounding her death greatly suggested otherwise. And the only way these contradictions could ever be reconciled is if we place it all in the context of the massive revelation made about Masaki about 503 chapters later, which was the fact that she wasn't just a regular human being, but rather a Quincy. The very second you make that connection, pretty much all the weirdness surrounding her death begins to make a lot more sense. Like, none of the things that happened that night could have unfolded the way it did if Masaki was really just human. I mean, just look at the time between when Masaki realized Ichigo was heading towards the edge of the road and when she actually started moving. There's no way a regular person could have moved quickly enough to catch Ichigo before he went tumbling down, or the fact that Grand Fisher would have already escaped with Ichigo by the time she had made it to the edge of the overpass, considering Hollows also move at superhuman speed. Especially Grand Fisher, whose speed was a problem for even Shinigami Ichigo. There's just no way an average person could reach it in time, not to even speak of intercepting it like the anime clearly showed. Which leads me to wonder, was Ichigo even Grand Fisher's target to begin with, or was it actually Masaki? And I'm almost convinced that this is actually the case. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because we still haven't answered our main question, which is why the hell is Ichigo still alive? Because even if we consider the fact that Ichigo wasn't Grand Fisher's main target, there'd still be very little reason to spare him since his spiritual powers would make for a pretty huge bonus in addition to Masaki. And after thinking about this way harder than I ever should have, I think I've been able to find two answers that work surprisingly well together. The first is the fact that Ichigo is still alive because I don't think Grand Fisher actually sensed him or his spiritual pressure. And yeah, it sounds a little nonsensical until you realize that's exactly what happened in Chapter 1, where Ichigo's spiritual pressure was so strong that it prevented Rukia from detecting Fishbone D, even to the point that Rukia couldn't physically hear its howls until Ichigo drew her attention to it. And that was only after it had broken into the Kurosaki house. At this point, we're talking about characters who, in the context of Bleach's grander power scale, would be literal fodder, in comparison to Masaki, who was a teenager, had the power to kill White in a single shot, and had most likely grown even stronger over the years, with an even weaker Kid Ichigo and Grand Fisher, who has worse sensory abilities than Shinigami Rukia, and without the insulation of a Gigai, which she wouldn't even need because she's a Quincy, she would stand out like a beacon to anyone with remotely decent senses, even if she did her best to lower it. But on any other day where Ichigo were to have been alone, he would have 100% been killed by Grand Fisher. It's probably why at the end of the Grand Fisher fight, Ishin calls Ichigo a lucky kid, because in any other situation without Masaki, Ichigo would have without a doubt been the one to die. Not to mention that after devouring a soul like Masaki's, I highly doubt Grand Fisher had room for anything else. This is because souls that mostly gain their power by absorbing the spiritual energy of other beings like Hollows and Quincy often have a hard limit on the specific amount of energy they can absorb at a go before it begins to have adverse effects. We see this fairly early in the story with Uryu, who takes serious damage from trying to absorb and redirect Ichigo's out-of-control Ryuryoku after the fight with the Menos Grande. So it stands to reason that even Hollows, who also gain their strength from devouring and absorbing the power of souls, would also have such a limit. Don't believe me? Well, we hear it from Grand Fisher himself. Right before he starts fighting Ichigo, where he counts the number of powerful souls he's about to consume, he wonders if he has enough room for such a massive feast. I repeat, Grand Fisher saw all these fodder characters who wouldn't even reach 10% of Masaki's power combined and thought he'd gotten a one-of-a-kind feast. So with that in mind, I really don't think Grand Fisher had the luxury of consuming another soul after absorbing one as dense as Masaki's. But then you might be wondering, wouldn't Masaki's soul have about as much spiritual pressure as a regular human by the time Grand Fisher consumed it, since the Auswahlen would have already taken all of Masaki's power? Well, that may be the case, but from everything we know about the Auswahlen, I think it might be quite unlikely. That's because we know that once a person survives Auswählen, they only permanently lose some of their powers, like the Vollständig. It does, however, leave them extremely weakened, but after a few minutes, they mostly regain their lost power, like we saw with Baz, Gigi, and Lily. Not to mention that it would be literally impossible to convert a special soul like a Quincy, Shinigamis, or Hollows into a regular human soul, since they're even anatomically different from each other. Considering souls with high spiritual pressure even need to eat while average souls do not. It's almost impossible to turn one into the other outside of crude methods like destroying the Saketsu and the Hakusui, which the Auswählen does not do. The only thing we can be sure it does is that it completely drains its victims of all the power within their bodies in the immediate moment. And if the victims themselves aren't already physically impaired in some way, like Katagiri and her illness, they most likely survive like these guys did. So if I were to hazard a guess, I'd say the difference between pre and post Auswählen and Masaki would be like Ichigo before the start of his fight with Grimjow and how exhausted and weakened he was after Notora came to wipe the floor with him. So it'd be the same Ichigo, same Bankai states, just exhausted of almost all his power. When you look at it that way, you can see why even in her weakened post-house Valen state, she would have still been a total feast for a being like Grand Fisher, who once again thought absolute fodder like Yuzukari and Seal State Ichigo and powerless Rukia was an all-you-can-eat buffet. So yeah, no matter how you spin it, Kid Ichigo would have been off the menu no matter what, which is why he survived that encounter. So we finally reached the end of the video, and it's genuinely surprising how every single detail fits so seamlessly with each other. It's kind of mind-blowing that the foundation of Bleach's most controversial plot twist was actually one of the earliest seeds planted in the story and had been waiting to be built upon in the final arc. But don't get me wrong though, I don't believe Kubo had the entire story figured out by chapter 1. There's evidence that there's some things he did and others he didn't. But I really believe that this entire plot point and everything involving Masaki's death, i.e., the weirdness surrounding it, was done on purpose to build up to this reveal in the final arc. I don't know if Kubo knew from the start that he was going to make her a Quincy, but there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests he never intended for her to be a regular human being. So in actuality, this was never a conversation about plot holes, but rather foreshadowing. Which is why I will aptly change the title of the video from the biggest plot hole in Bleach to something much more fitting, like how Kubo foreshadowed Bleach's most controversial plot twist, all while avoiding creating the biggest plot hole in the story by creating said plot hole and only resolving it hundreds of chapters later. Okay, biggest plot hole it is. Alright, if you've made it this far, I'd like to say a big thank you. This video took forever to come out because I lost my main PC in a house fire and then someone broke into my room and stole my new PC until I finally got my third one not too long ago. But don't worry, I'm here now and hopefully this time I'll be keeping y'all company until we finally reach Core 4. So take care and please like and subscribe and I will see you in the next Bleach video.